Greed is at the base of every crime that Sante was convicted of. But what makes Sante's crimes unique is that she committed the most violent of those crimes with her youngest son, Kenneth Kimes Jr. So not only was she dubbed the Dragon Lady, Sante and Kenneth Jr. were dubbed Mommy and Clyde. Like every intricate story, the best place to start is at the beginning. And I think that there were events in young Sante Kimes' life that led her to become who she eventually became, which was a robber, a serial arsonist, a serial killer. Well, Sante Kimes was born Sandra Louise Singer in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, July 24th, 1934. Sante's mother, Mary Van Horn, an Illinois native, was of Dutch ancestry, and her husband, Prama, was an immigrant from East India. So when you learn about Sante Kimes, what you'll hear is that she favored Elizabeth Taylor a lot. And I think that if we want to know where Sante's olive complexion originated from, it would definitely be her East Indian heritage. Well, when Sante was just 3 years old, her father abandoned the family. And so Mary Horn has four children, is 1937, 1938, and she turned to prostitution in order to take care of herself and her children. And according to Sante's estranged sister, after their mother turned to prostitution, Sante was molested by several men. And I think that when there is not just a separation of your parents, but your father abandons the family and your mother goes into this lifestyle of prostitution, and Sante ends up being molested by what her sister described as several adults. I think that young Sante's life took a dark turn then and did not ever look back toward the light, if you know what I mean. So Sante's sister goes on to say that, as an adolescent and a teenager, that Sante was a pyromaniac, that she would hold her hands. This particular sister says Sante would hold her hands and that she would burn her fingertips, and that Sante tortured the farm animals and the family dog with a hat pin. I think that might explain why the next event in Sante's life. Her mother moves with her and her younger sister to California. And from what I find, Sante was promptly adopted. End quote. Promptly adopted. I think that maybe, and this is conjecture, Sante could have been a little more than a handful for her mother to handle. I mean, at this point, Sante is closer to adulthood than she is childhood. So the fact that the mother moves from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, with Sante and her sister, and Sante is promptly adopted by this couple who also simultaneously adopts a boy child, I think is very telling. So, what I found out about the couple who adopted Sante is that they were a religious couple and they couldn't have children. And after adopting Sante and the boy child, the couple left California and moved to Nevada. And Sante would enter high school in Carson City, Nevada, and she'd graduate there. And what I found in my research is that in high school, Sante liked to bully and intimidate younger students. So, a few months after high school, Sante enters into her first marriage, and I believe his name is Lee Powers. This first marriage only lasted a few months, and is barely mentioned in Sante's biographies. Sante, after she divorces Lee, who was her high school sweetheart, she decides to date Edward Walker. And she had also gone to high school with Ed Walker, but they'd been on again, off again. So in 1957, Sante marries Ed Walker, and Ed Walker is a general contractor. And Sante and Ed have a child. Sante has her first son, Kent, Kent Walker. And Kent, by the way, says he remembers shoplifting with his mother as young as 4 years old. So Ed is a general contractor. And what starts to happen is a lot of the homes that Ed was in charge of, that he was building and in charge of supervising, began to burn to the ground. Burned to the ground. There was one fire where the house didn't burn to the ground, but it did destroy the kitchen. And I believe this was around 1960. And Ed received a $10,000 check. Now, $10,000 in 1960, 1961 is the equivalent to about $103,000 today. So, prosecutors believe that Sante became a serial arsonist at this time. And she did it all, of course. It was fraud to collect the insurance. Well, meanwhile, Sante is also sleeping around with Ed's business partners. And so the marriage is a little rocky, and Sante and Ed would split up at times. And once, while they were separated, Sante was charged and convicted of petty theft. She went back to Ed. She stayed with him a few months. And after that, they called it quits. She was out of there. And Sante was long gone by the time her divorce to her second husband, Ed Walker, was finalized in 1969. So Sante is no longer little Sandra Louise Singer. She is Sante Kimes. She's the mother of one, Kent Walker. And Sante was such a good con woman that she actually signed autographs as Elizabeth Taylor. And she wore these long, flowing white gowns. Like I said, she caked on the makeup. She had these high cheekbones, and she would wear these really, really high black wigs. So Sante is prowling around for another husband. And she reads in Millionaire magazine, and this is disputed somewhat. Some say that Sante's third husband was looking to hire someone like an interior designer. And that's how Kenneth Kimes Sr. met Sante. But most researchers agree that Sante actually was reading an article in Millionaire magazine, and she read that a real estate developer, Kenneth Kimes, had just been divorced and is around 1971. And Kenneth Kimes' net worth, according to Millionaire magazine, is $20 million. Well, today, that's about $120 million. And Sante meets Kenneth Kimes. And she and Kenneth Kimes start dating. And eventually, they have a son, Kenneth Kimes Jr. Now, Kenneth Kimes was Sante Sr. by about 16 years. And he was born actually in Prague, Oklahoma. So Kenneth and Sante were actually born in the same state. And Kenneth's family moved to California during the Great Migration. And they weren't wealthy. Kenneth talked about picking melons for money and how he was the fastest, melon picker out there. And eventually, Kenneth Kimes Sr., he joined the military. When World War II began, I read that Kenneth Kimes Sr. was one of the first to enlist. And while he was in the military, he met and fell in love with a woman from Texas named Charlotte. And he and Charlotte married. So Charlotte, according to Charlotte, when Kenneth got out of the military, they built a house, they invested in building a home, and they sold it. And so they would build homes or they would buy trailers and they would sell them. And that the money was so good that they decided to start investing in and building motels. And Charlotte says that the more money they made instead of relaxing and enjoying family, because Charlotte and Kenneth Kimes Sr. had a son and a daughter, they had two children. She said all Kenneth Kimes wanted was more and more money. And once she started a divorce against Kenneth, she said she believed he was just socking away cash the minute that they started making it. She made it out of that marriage, I think, with barely $100,000. And she said she was happy to go. So now Kenneth Kimes Sr., who really loves making money, is with Sante. And eventually he marries Sante after about being together for 10 years, a decade. He and Sante marry and she becomes Sante Kimes legally. Remember, Kenneth began to build motels. And there's another event after Sante's abandonment from her father and what her sister says happened to her. There's another event that I believe changed everything with Sante Kimes. She and Kenneth, when they were living in, I believe, La Jolla, California, would drive over into Mexico. And according to the federal prosecutor, she and Kenneth would drive over in a really big, fancy Cadillac, and they would go into these small villages in Mexico, and Sante would offer work to these young girls as maids. And she would promise the families of these young girls not only will they be paid for their work, but they will receive days off and they will always, always, always be able to keep in touch with family. Well, from everything I understand, Sante and Kenneth already had deadbolts on the doors before they got these young girls back to the United States. And these young women were locked in by deadbolt. And if they protested, they were beaten. In fact, I read where a neighbor said she saw, quote, a young Mexican girl running barefoot away from the Kimes' home, and Sante running after the girl, caught up to her and drug her back. I don't know if I could have watched that and not dial 911. Hopefully, however, it broke that Sante and Kenneth Kimes Sr. were forcing their maids to work for free, were keeping them locked in locked rooms and not paying them. Not, and of course, these young women weren't allowed to keep in touch with their families. I hope that story broke after the neighbor saw what she saw. But what really, really kind of bothers me is that friends of the Kimeses said they would go over to visit and that the locks on the doors would be on the opposite side of the door that you would expect. And they would go to leave and they couldn't even leave until Sante pulled out keys and unlocked the door. So these young women are immigrants. Who knows how much any of them spoke the language? Sante and Kenneth did not allow them to wear socks or shoes, and they were kept in dead bolted rooms. And that is not only how Sante and Kenneth's three luxury homes were cleaned, that's also how the motels that Kenneth Kimes owned were cleaned. Eventually, Sante and Kenneth would be arrested and charged with violating The anti-slavery statute. When is the last time you all have heard of Americans violating an anti-slavery statute? I can think of maybe one other case in the 20th century that came out of New York. So when I say a case involving the anti-slavery statute, I mean a case in the 20th century, in the late 20th century. Sante Kimes was convicted of violating the anti slavery statute in federal court in 1985. Kenneth Kimes Sr. pled guilty, and he pled guilty to a reduced charge. And I did read that part of his guilty plea was to take alcohol classes. So I guess circa 1985, maybe drinking too much was an excuse, and you can claim that you didn't hear or have any idea that young women were being beaten in your home, that you didn't think it was odd or you didn't notice that they had on no socks and shoes, and that they could not move about freely. I think the deadbolts, locking them into rooms. Anyway, anyway, I digress. So Sante ends up serving 4 hard years in prison. Now, Sante has, up to this point, been convicted of petty theft. She reportedly jumped in a car off of a car lot in Honolulu, said she was test driving it. Sante had this car for weeks, if not months. When police caught up to her, Sante just said she was still test driving it. She stole a fur coat out of a hotel. I think the fur coat is what's said to be worth, I don't know, $6,000, $6,500. Sante, by the way, is married to a millionaire when she does this. And that conviction was overturned. So up until Sante was convicted of violating the anti-slavery statute, I don't believe she had ever faced real consequence. And I don't know how much, or I won't say I won't know how much Sante loved her sons, because I think Sante's ability to love is extremely skewed, if it exists at all. Her oldest son, Kent Kimes, said he tried to save his younger brother, Kenneth Jr., from his mother's influence, but he eventually realized that Kenneth Jr. was just as greedy as Sante. I will say that what I was getting to is Sante being separated from her children. But I think it's safer to assume that Sante being locked in a cell away from her luxurious life, that her con woman ways didn't work, because in court, Sante would burst out and say, "That's not true. That's a lie." I think that after she did that prison time, Sante decided she was not ever going back to prison. And the conviction, the anti slavery violation, that conviction, and Kenneth Kimes pleading guilty even to a lesser charge, once again changes Sante's life. Because, see, it's not over after she's released from prison and she's reunited with Kent and little Kenneth and Kenneth Kimes Jr. It's not over. You see, an attorney representing those young Mexican girls who were locked up and beaten and forced to work for free, isolated from family, from their native country, filed a $25 million lawsuit. And Sante, the last thing Sante was going to let happen was her wealth being taken from her, not even a dollar of it. I will get into Sante Kimes's first murder and the involvement of her son and the death of her third husband in the next video.